thanks so much for coming to my talk. It's about technical design. To give a quick heads up about why I wanted to give this talk is that when I started out in the industry, I didn't even really know about this role. And as I've journeyed through various game development roles and evolved into this position, I realized that it was pretty much exactly where I wanted to be and where it fit really well. And I just wanted to sort of explain a little bit about what's involved with technical design, and I see the role pop up a little more often now, and I really hope that this can give you a little bit of understanding about a role that I think is maybe a little underutilized, or maybe it is utilized but people don't recognize it in a way. Right, so these are the topics that I want to cover. Practical prototyping, which is sort of prototyping in a really useful way. I want to talk a little bit about tools, creating tools that you use, and the idea of how a technical designer and tools are so closely related, how to become a technical designer, and when a studio might want to have a technical designer on their team. So a little about me first. I started making games in the early thousands as a hobby, indie games, making things with Game Maker and RPG Maker and all those kind of stuff. After high school, I studied interactive gaming at Media Design School. Had a couple of brief interludes working on business software, realized that yes, it's definitely games that I want to work on. Moved into the game development course at Media Design School. Then I worked at Gameloft for 5 years as a programmer. I got very lucky with Gameloft starting out in Auckland, basically at the end of my studies. Went straight in there and was at Gameloft from basically the start till the end. And then moved to Artrix and now Outer Dawn, where I currently work as a senior technical designer, and I work on a game called Grimguard Tactics. I'll get a little bit more into Grimguard Tactics in a little bit, if you haven't seen it already. So sort of a brief overview of what a technical designer does. It's kind of something that I see when the position pops up. People have different ideas in their heads of what a technical designer does. So it's different within different companies, and even within a studio, the roles could be different. You could have two different technical designers working on completely different areas of the game. So I've done a lot of different things, even as a technical designer, and I sort of see the role a little bit as a multi-tool, something that can be deployed where the project needs it most. So the thing about like a pocket knife or a multi-tool is that, sometimes the multi-tool or sometimes a pocket knife has a little toothpick, sometimes it doesn't. There's still pocket knives, there's the same thing. They just have slightly different purposes. And in some cases, maybe a screwdriver is the best thing to do to undo a screw, there's a tool for it with an exact purpose. But sometimes you can only carry a pocket knife, and that's what a technical designer is. So if any of you have played Dragon's Dogma, this is sort of my interpretation of the vocations or like character classes from that game. So they have this really creative sort of character system where they have like you've got like some swords people and some archers and some magicians. But they had the idea of what they call hybrid vocations, which are something in between. And I really loved this concept. I thought it was a really brilliant idea. And so I think it kind of maps onto some of these game development roles really well, where I look at the programmer as the swordsman, and then the advanced vocation, which is sort of the very specific variant of that role, is the one with the gigantic sword, like Guts from Berserk. So that's like engine code. Like I've stepped away from like a generalist coder. I am doing specifically engine code. That's my very specific role. And you get that kind of thing along those lines with artists and designers as well, moving into very specific roles. And then you have these hybrid vocations, which are for the arisen only. doesn't really apply. So you have someone between an artist and a programmer. Could be a technical artist, someone who works on shader code, which is something that you need some kind of code knowledge to be able to write optimal shaders. But you also need to have that artistic vision, because at the end of the day, the shader is artistic. It's a very visual thing. Similarly, I see someone who works in UI or UX as the hybrid vocation of a designer and an artist, someone who understands not only to make the game look, the game's UI has to look nice, it has to fit the narrative, it has to work really well, but it needs that design behind it as well. You need someone with a design mind and an art mind. And so that brings to technical designer, which is the hybrid vocation of programming and design. Someone in between those two roles who can be a facilitator or do something specific within that space. Because I kind of want to reject the idea of this, the jack of all trades, master of none, because I wouldn't say that to a technical artist or a UI person. That's incredibly offensive. It's a specific thing, right? It's a specific role with a specific goal in mind. So the first thing that I want to talk about is practical prototyping. And I see prototyping as a good system to think about it in the same way that you might think about the scientific method. And in the scientific method, you're trying to answer a question. And so that's the very first part. That's the first part of the cycle, is figuring out what that question is. So you make an observation or a question. Then you research that topic or area, you come up with a hypothesis, you test an experiment, you analyze the data and the output, and then you report your conclusions. To give an example of this, the tactics game that we're working on, Grimguard Tactics, has, for example, it has a grid. Everything's based on a grid, kind of like, chess, if you haven't played a tactics game before. So one of the questions we wanted to ask, among many others, is how big should the grid be? And so that was the observation, or the question was, how big should we make the grid for our game? And so the first step was research, was looking at what other games did, what other mobile games did in particular, that had a very similar sort of gameplay. Then we came up with a hypothesis. We thought, well, maybe somewhere between like 5x5 to 9x9, maybe larger, maybe smaller, but we'll try out somewhere in between there. We'll try out 7x7, or we'll try out 9x9 first, and then you test it. You build a prototype that has that grid size in it, and you try it out, and you iterate. Ideally, you build that prototype with all the different sizes in mind so that you can see which one works the best without rebuilding the game, and I'll get to that in a bit too. Then you analyze the data, which is to play the game and try it out, see what people think, see what you can get into the prototype that fits well with what you're trying to make, and whether the choice that you hypothesized was the right one. Then you report the conclusions, which is an important part of it. It's to really explain to the team why you've landed on the decision that you've landed on. So for the Grimguard example, we did that by making a prototype that had different grid sizes. We tried out, you can even prototype sometimes just with visuals. We mocked up screenshots of different grid sizes, and then we put them on device just to see how small things got when the grid size got bigger, or how small could we get the grid without removing too many tactical decisions from the game. So Grimguard started off as prototypes, and the very, very first part of Grimguard was this idea of some core pillars. So we had a few core pillars that we really wanted to drive through the entire production of the game. And the first pillar was a team of 3, a tank character, an assault character, and a support character. So someone who could soak up damage, someone who could deal damage, and someone who could either make some kind of effect on the battlefield to assist the other ones, your other heroes, or hinder the opponents. The next idea that we wanted to build into the core pillar of the game is the idea of heroes as classes. Rather than an individual hero is a unique character, a unique named character, they are part of a class. This barbarian here, you could have 6 barbarians and they'll all be slightly different. They have different abilities, different perks, different names, different stats. So that was one of the ideas that our core pillar. The next core pillar, which is the most important one, is we wanted to make a simple to play tactical game for mobile devices. We really wanted to make sure that whatever we made felt like a mobile game. It fit what players want from a mobile game. And so, yeah, that format is really, really important. We're building the game for that format. And we had to make sure that whatever we do, these 3 core pillars were met. And notice I say tactical, I don't say turn-based tactics. And that brings me to the next point. This was the first prototype. This was the first prototype that I made for Grimguard, and at the time, it was a real-time tactics game. I made it in Unity using a bunch of cubes and letters and some free game icons. I spent a few weeks trying out a whole bunch of different ideas to try out this gameplay as a real-time tactics game. But the idea as well was that everything was throwaway, so I'm not trying to build core systems that'll be in use forever. Anything that I did, I knew that we would chuck away, so it could speed up things a bit in the iteration. And so this prototype was a prototype failure, failure in quotes, but what we found was that it was very hard to find a middle ground for the game that hit our core pillars, because it was either with 3 characters, either we could hit the pillar that said that they feel very unique. The 3 roles felt like very unique roles. And then you felt frustrated that you didn't have that absolute control over those 3 characters, because you really, really want to move your tank into a specific place, and you want your DPS to either get in there or hang back, and you want the support to do whatever they do. And not having that control, that tight control over all the characters, felt frustrating. On the other hand, if we added that tight control and let the characters feel unique, then it took away from the core idea, the other core pillar, which was a very simple and fun to play mobile game. You're micromanaging a whole bunch of characters running around with abilities. And the biggest problem with this is that there were no precedents for what we wanted. We couldn't point to another game and say, yeah, like that, but with this. What we were trying out was such a unique concept that we really could only explore it with prototypes. So from that prototype, we thought, well, maybe a turn-based game would be a better fit, because we could hit all 3 pillars if we went turn-based. So we went back to that scientific method. So the first step, I guess, was research. So started playing a whole bunch of turn-based tactics games to get ideas and inspiration and understand what made these games work. So I was looking at especially mobile games, because we were making a mobile game and we wanted to understand what challenges other mobile tactics games had come across and how they had hurdled those challenges, but other tactics games in general as well. So things like XCOM and Fire Emblem, Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, they're all fantastic games, and they have different approaches to everything. They have different approaches to how to show your movement range, your attack range, how to show what they do with cover, if they use cover, or different terrain. The choices that all these games made were so vastly different from each other, and we had to decide how we were going to make those decisions, like what was the best fit with all of those various decisions for our game. So yeah, I noted the similarities and differences between those games so I could understand them better. I've got a video of what that first prototype, or the second prototype, looked like. So these characters here, part of the prototype was that core pillar of the unique, the heroes as classes. So when Note that UI wasn't a consideration for this prototype. So each of those characters had 3 different options, and they had different abilities and different stats. So that was one of the sort of things that the prototype had to take into consideration. From there, it was interface. So we had a full turn-based game in this prototype with ranged attacks, melee attacks, temporary hit points and shields, tiles that do damage when you stand on them. The idea of a treasure chest that if you didn't get to it in time, it would disappear and you wouldn't get the rewards. It's got a turn order tracker. It's got it's got AI for the enemies. It's got all sorts of this ability, fireball ability. All of the 3 main classes that we wanted to hit. So this kind of hit those pillars. There was what we wanted to explore. The AI isn't particularly smart. It just ran over the poison puddle and died. Tile elements like this one in that sort of fortress-looking tile has extra health in there. That's a boss battle. It's got 2 little cube horns. It has mechanics like shoving as well. Shoving characters into other characters to deal damage to both of them. Very Into the Breach if you've ever played that. Alright, victory screen. Cool. Alright, that's cool. So I want to bring this. You only saw this for like a split second, but this is probably the most important part of that whole prototype, and that's the options that I had built into the prototype. And so, for all of those decisions that I was researching in those various turn-based tactics games, I wanted to build them into the prototype in a way that we could test easily the relationship between those options. Things like, whether you could move on diagonals or attack on diagonals and what that meant, and whether you could move through enemies, whether if you stayed still, if you could attack twice instead of moving. What happens if you end your turn without moving? We had different ideas for sort of bonus abilities that could trigger at that point. Things like Overwatch or one Hunker where you get extra temporary hit points. Tested the turn order, so I can change it from being an initiative system to being able to pick and choose which character moves. So all of this was built into this prototype. And what that meant was that when we're trying out different options and we're trying to decide what we want to make, we can, in the meeting room, try out all the different options from one build. We don't have to do a new deploy and get everyone to download all these different dodgy APKs onto their Androids, and they get lost in tens of folders. It's a single place that you can try things out and find a solution that works. And so this prototype was a success. And we knew it was successful when we went into a meeting room to discuss the latest iteration, and everyone was very quiet. There were no suggestions of, we should do this, we should iterate on that, we should try this other option. So that was a great sign. And so this is what it is now. We built that. You can see a lot of similarities. There's still things that we've iterated on, and we will continue to iterate on, but it became the reference point. Normally, you have to rely on other people making games and then point at them as the reference point. But because we had the prototype, we could always refer to something that had what we wanted to explore as its core pillars. And so, yeah, that gave us a great basis that we're still, working from. And we can still hit those core pillars. We know that what we had from the get-go was a pretty good idea. So bringing back to technical design, and why I think technical design is basically the ideal role for prototyping. And that's because, I wouldn't necessarily consider myself an artist, and so, but I don't think art is really necessary for a prototype, or it depends what you're prototyping. If you're prototyping a new art mechanic or some kind of cool new system that you want to build your game around, then yes, you need an artist, like a technical artist, to work with you. But if what you you're trying to explore can be resolved with cubes, then all you really need is a technical designer. So it wasn't necessary for anyone else to be working with me to test that hypothesis. I could iterate on it myself and make builds and take suggestions and essentially work on the project and work on the prototype as fast as possible, because you don't have communication between design and code and that back and forth that can slow things down. The fewer people required for a change, the faster you can make that change. And that kind of brings to tools as well, and that's the idea that technical design can also iterate on tools when and how they need them. So there was a great talk earlier today about tools at the Dinosaur Polo Club, and that's the right name, right? Yeah. And that's goes a lot more in depth than this. So if you missed it, have a look for it. But the idea that design sometimes there's no time for tools, because if you're on a small team and you are trying to do as many features as you can within a very short amount of time with very few people, you need whoever's using the tools to be able to make those small tweaks when and if they need them. For example, being able to quickly edit the level editor in Grimguard to have all the enemies rotate forward instead of clicking on them and then manually rotating them in the Unity editor. It's just a very small thing, but if you have someone the person who's using it, and they realize that frustration and they can just go in and change it in 10 minutes, it just removes that friction. And I think that's sort of one of the benefits of having the person who's using the tools able to iterate on them themselves. Another example of that is that as one of the things I had to work on was balancing the rewards that you got from all of the encounters in the game. And so probably the best solution would be to have the game simulate the economy from within the engine using all of the data that we have. But that would take time to build, and I could do something myself that would simulate it well enough for me to get the results that I need spit out in an Excel sheet that has all of the rewards for the player based on, essentially, if I know that the player in Act 3 has level 3 equipment and level 4 abilities and has a set of rare characters, then I kind of know how many resources the player, or I can calculate how many resources I need to give the player by that point, and then I can use my tool to spit out a bunch of rewards for each of the encounters leading up to that point. So there's an ideal way to do it, and then there's the fast way to do it. And this meant that we didn't have to compromise on any other features in the game. So sort of how-to with a technical designer covers a couple of things: how to become a technical designer, how to utilize a technical designer. If you want to become a technical designer, that normally means that you've come from either a design point of view or a programmer point of view. So it's often a programmer who learns design skills, or a designer who learns some coding skills. And either way is valid. Like, it's a great path to get into a technical design role. They both have their own challenges, but they also it has great benefits to sort of dip into some other discipline's knowledge pool, especially if you're interested in it. Probably only if you're interested in it. If you're really happy being a coder, you don't need to get into design. You can go engine code, you can have a lot of fun. This is more if you're interested in finding that middle ground, like I was, and I found it really rewarding. So I really want to encourage anyone who's looking to be in that middle ground to try and find some way to get there. So as a designer, if you want to be a technical designer, I would encourage you to get comfortable and independent in your game engine. I would want you to be able to make changes to the game without requiring any tech input. Of course, they're there for assistance, and you should rely on that, but the more you can feel comfortable in your game and messing around with the numbers, if you have jumping physics, the more you can iterate on how that jump feels without hassling anyone or writing documentation, the better. If you can do that yourself, that's going to be the best solution. I would suggest just learning some kind of game development, even simple things like learning Dreams for PlayStation would be a great way to get some skills, programming skills, without jumping right in the deep end. You don't have to. We have so many good tools now. We have great game engines that are so easy to use. We have tons of resources. Unity is a great one. That's a course that I really recommend. That was what I used before touching Unity and getting a job that used Unity. I used this to get me up to speed. I already came from a programming background, so it wasn't hard to get up to speed with it, but it's a great course, and it goes from the ground up, and it helps you navigate Unity and learn how to make games in a very concise way. And I would say, as a designer, try and get permission and assistance. Try and get that go-ahead from your studio to be able to get in there and start messing with those numbers, start messing with the code. Of course with assistance, but try and get out of your comfort zone and try and get some help from your studio to be able to explore that. As a programmer, I think that if you want to become a technical designer, or even a gameplay programmer really, I would want you to start researching. And there's more to, because there's more to coding a game than just making it work. You have to understand why the game design works, and that requires a lot of research. It requires looking at other games and seeing how they work, seeing what challenges they had to overcome, why they landed on the solution they did. We all work in games, or I think most of us work in games, and some are game adjacent. We know that nothing went into the game without a great deal of thought behind it. Even if we made a mistake and something isn't quite as ideal as it should be, there was a lot of thought behind everything that went into every game out there. And so when you look at a game and you understand what they're doing, you know that there was a lot of thought that led them to get to where it is, and you can try and deconstruct that and build up how you want to do it in your own game. There's something that I've sort of heard a bit before about people wanting to make unique games, and or even unique art, where they say, "Oh, I don't play any other games in the genre that I'm making because I want to make something unique. And if I'm looking at everyone else, then I won't make something unique." But I think that's the wrong approach, because if you don't know what's out there, you don't know that you're copying something else. The more you understand about the entire battlefield of games that are like what you're trying to make, the more you can understand where you can iterate and where you can create something new. So I think that research is just a really important part of being a technical designer, being a designer. And so if you want to move into that role from a programmer perspective, you have to learn how to understand the reasons behind game design decisions. And finally, as anyone, I would recommend you to do some game jams. And I mean anyone, like anyone in any part of any studio should be doing game jams for so many reasons. Having a really small team and a really tight deadline means you'll be learning how to work at your maximum efficiency. You'll learn how to scope, you'll learn how to communicate, to multitask, and prioritize. Especially prioritization, like that's the biggest part of this, because there's only so much time you have, and you want to do a lot. You have to choose what will go in, and you'll have to pivot on Saturday when nothing you wanted to do is working, and you need to wrap it up by Sunday. And the coolest thing about game jams is you can set your own goals, and you can't fail them. There's no way to fail a game jam, because it's like failing a sketch. Is practice. So go in with a goal. You could try to go into a game jam just to learn a new tool. I would set your expectations like rock bottom if you're trying to learn a new tool in a game jam. But it's a great experience because there's like a lot of social pressure to be working really hard, and so you'll be focused for that time. and you'll at least learn something. You could try a unique game mechanic. So the little one on the side with the horse is a game jam. I wanted to explore the idea of a cooperative game where you couldn't get too far away from each other or your horse costume would explode. You could try to work on a new genre, something you haven't done before, something that just to practice, really. You could work with someone new. The last game jam I did, I worked with two strangers who hadn't done an in-person game jam before. And so you can just completely find someone completely new and make a game with them, and at the end of the weekend, you've got something. Or maybe you don't, and it doesn't matter. It's the coolest feeling. And some further game jam tips, I would say you don't... I think people hear game jam and they think about all the stress and how much they won't be able to sleep for a weekend, but that's wrong. You can sleep. You can sleep 8 hours, you can eat full meals, you can relax. Yeah, you just keep the scope minuscule and then you'll be okay. Just keep the scope as small as you possibly can and just do something, anything, and you'll be successful. And then just chuck it away. You're done. It's all right. You can throw away a game jam when you're done. You don't have to sit there and go, all right, now how do I get it onto Steam? You don't have to think about the game code that you did in a rush and it's kind of messy. You don't have to build from that. You can chuck it all out. If you really love what you made, you'd start it from scratch. But chuck away the game jam. Think of game jams as sketches. I mentioned it before. I'll bring it up again. It's a sketch. If you're an artist, you're probably sketching every day as practice, as part of your tool set. And I think that for a technical designer, game jams are kind of a sketch. It's something you can use to practice and get better at pretty much any of your skills. Anything you want to practice, you can practice it at a game jam. Except maybe long-term planning. That's what producers are for, right? And then finally, when to hire, I think I said when finally on the last one, when to hire a technical designer. If you've got a small team, you'll probably end up with some multidiscipline team members anyway. So you could make that role official. If someone's already doing design and code, you could just call them a technical designer if they want that title. You've probably already got one. If you've got a low budget, you probably want a designer with a tech point of view so they know what's possible within a small scoped time frame. And then they can help you build it as well. You can force them to help with whatever designs they came up with. So it works pretty well from that point of view. If you've got lots of projects running at once and you need someone to just be useful at all times, a technical designer is useful at any point of any project. From prototyping through to tools or support, gameplay, iteration, bug fixing, right at the end, and then back to prototyping the next one. And if you have someone on your team who is keen to become a technical designer, I think it's worth it for everyone to help them out, get there. Figure out a game plan to get them into that role. Something that works for both of you. Training or support to help the employee upskill, because that's what it is really, it's upskilling. If you've got a designer and they want to become a technical designer, then it's them learning new skills to get there. It's learning code and getting into the engine, becoming, a differently useful part of the team. And take a chance with it. And technical design really relies on trust. You have to trust your technical designer to be able to make design calls, because that's where you get the most benefit out of a technical designer, is when they can operate at maximum efficiency, iterate and work with a lot of speed. So you need to be able to trust them to be able to make a bunch of design calls and then trust them to explain them well to you at the end of it. So yeah, communication is a huge part of a technical designer's job. And then you also have to trust them with access when they need it to various parts of your game. The more that the technical designer feels comfortable with editing and modifying and getting in there and changing things, the more they can affect the game and get their designs to fruition. All right. So I think we still have quite a lot of time for questions. So if anyone wants me to go back to any previous slide or expand on anything, yeah, the floor is open. Yeah.
How do you find the balance between more technical versus design in the like day to day? Like, do you set aside specific time to do specific parts of the role, or set aside like day to day, or does it just depend on like producer assigning?
So the question is, how do I balance between more technical roles like code roles, jobs or tasks versus design tasks? It really kind of depends on what I need to be doing. Essentially, like I've in what stage of the project we're in. If we're at the start of if we're at the end of a sprint, I would be ideally planning the next sprint, like writing design documents, sticking to like the design side of things really, and then at the end of a sprint, more focused on implementation. Start of a sprint, I suppose. Focus on implementation, trying to get those features in based on the designs. So it kind of balances out depending on what needs to be done. Yeah.
The code that you write, does that still fall under like the code department's banner? Do you still get code reviews? Is it kept to the same kind of standard, or are you kind of an exception?
So the question is any code that I write held to the code standards? Definitely yes. Yeah, it definitely comes under code. If I write something, I get it checked with code, and yeah, anything like for example, like tweaking how the game decides what tile is tapped on, with some sort of smart logic to try and help the players derive the player's intended behavior when the finger touches the screen, kind of thing. So if I change how that behavior works, then I will get that code checked. Yeah. Yeah.
If a student's gone through their University of Tertiary Education learning both design and programming, when they're trying to enter the industry, would you suggest that they go for either programming or artistry first and then try and move into a TD or TA role? Or would you suggest to go straight into those TD or TA roles?
So the question is, would I recommend a student who is studying both, I guess, design and programming? Would I recommend they try and get into a technical, like a hybrid role or a specific role? I would say for a student, just about any role you can get is a good step. I mean, I changed from being a full-time game programmer into being a technical designer. It is a difficult thing to sort of cross streams like that, because I think internally when someone sees someone changing roles, they almost subtract. Like they see someone going from design into code, for example, they might internally subtract some of the code, some of the design skills from their code skills, because they see it as like a limit to that value. I don't think that's really true, but it could be part of it. So it is hard to change roles once you're ingrained, but it is possible as well, especially if you create examples of work of what basically try and work towards whatever final position that you want to have, but take any steps you can in order to get there. If you can get, if what you're currently best at is code, then get a code job and create good examples of code, get that code job, and then continue working towards that technical design role. Similarly, it's probably very hard to get a graduate design role, because no one wants to hire someone who hasn't got a game that says that they designed it on them. So from that point of view, that's where I think things like game jams come in really handy, because you can actually get a backlog of things that you've worked on and have some design credits, even if you're the only one on it. It's something, it's something to point to and say that you worked on it. Definitely the ideal is just getting any position you can, work towards something, work towards being really good at something, get a job that lets you do that, and then work towards whatever you really want to do. Yeah, any more questions at the back?
And what was your experience in terms of like communicating with other disciplines about what they could expect from tech designers, like how to use us, what to expect from us?
So the question is, how do I communicate with the rest of the team about how best to utilize the technical design role, like how I fit in with the team? That's a pretty good question. It's most of the people that I work with, I've known for quite a long time and worked with them before the studio. So I think I bypassed some of that a little bit with just some sort of personal connections. But I would say that I think the best way to do it is just to explain what you want to do and what you can work on. A technical designer, there's so many different things that role could mean and what you could work on that I think it's sort of up to the person to communicate what they want to work on and what they can be most useful doing. Some technical designers will focus on tools, and sometimes it's up to the job description itself. If you're applying to a technical designer position and that job description mentions tools, that's probably what they're expecting you to do, and that's sort of how you'll fit into that team. If your job description is focused on prototypes, which is what my initial job description was about, was prototyping, so that's where I sort of most fit into the studio as someone who would create prototypes and iterate on design ideas. So yeah, I suppose the answer is just to it's based on a lot of different factors, and I think it sort of comes a bit naturally where you fit in a team, and you kind of iterate on the team itself, I suppose. Yeah.
If a technical designer is leading the design of mental models for like how the code is organized, but and is to lack be lacking in knowledge or knowledge of language design and like things which the code part would be responsible for. How do you coordinate those discussions?
So the question is about how do you coordinate discussions between technical design and code when when the technical design is sort of coming up with the structure, I suppose. Sorry, it's a little. I'm not sure I completely understand, but I'm definitely, as a technical designer, I'm not defining any of how code runs. It's definitely the code side has their own structure and they build the game. I'm only really there to be a facilitator or to iterate on something very specific within the game, within the constructed tech framework. So I definitely wouldn't be there, defining the sort of game's structure in any way, more iterating on what there already exists. Any more questions? Yeah.
How do you sort of find that line when to pass something off to a programmer
Mm.
or when to do it yourself? If that's something, say, you're capable of doing but might be quite time intensive, would your time better be spent doing more design stuff, or should you then pass it on to a programmer, for example?
Right. So the question is when to pass on a task to a programmer, essentially. And that is, probably a lot of that comes down to communication about what the problem is. A lot of the time, if it's something that's already exists and I'm just merely tweaking something, like changing numbers, then I probably don't need to have much communication with anyone else on that, apart from the initial idea of we need to change some of these numbers. If it's anything further than that, then I would initiate a conversation with code about what I want to happen. often it is a lot faster just for code to make those changes if it's anything significant. So that's generally the first step. Is just communication with code about what the changes are, what they could involve, and depending on how big, maybe it becomes a user story, goes through the whole design process. Technical design is definitely more for either small changes or iteration or prototypes where you don't really need to interact too much with the sort of core systems. Anything past that, I would definitely communicate with code, and it becomes more of a sort of traditional designer coder sort of system from that point. Cool. Still got 5 minutes. Any more questions? I could check up the video of Grimgard maybe. Oh, I think
One more question.
I can. Oh yeah, sure.
Do you have any interest in learning art and completing the full?
Oh man, the amount of times I've started a Blender tutorial. I've tried. It's too difficult. It's to balance everything is hard. I know where my weaknesses lie. I'm not very good at, for example, UI or UX. A lot of that kind of thing is leaning on a team that is very good at those things. We have a fairly small but very talented team, and so for things that I'm not good at, I don't need to be good at them. I've got a team that I can rely on and work with very closely. Yeah, so no, not really. I can do pixel art and that's about it. Sweet. Does anyone here do game jams? There's a few, not enough. I'm disappointed. It's worth doing. I really, really recommend it. Even at least once. Just they're like the highlight of my year.
How do you get into it?
So there's a couple of game jams normally each year. There's Kiwi Jam and Global Game Jam are the big ones that I normally go to. There's probably a lot of like local ones. I know Pickpock run their own game jams, which is super cool to hear. But normally you basically sign up, show up, and then make something. They're normally very lightly, they're very light. You can sort of come in and do almost whatever you want, game adjacent, and it's fine. You can even work on a game that you've already been working on, but you're surrounded by other people who are working very hard on something, and that's kind of... It's like the energy in the room is really useful for staying focused and making something cool. Yeah.
I think someone asked a question in the app.
Oh. Yeah. All right. The question is, that jam game with the sheep, was that by chance part of the GMTK jam? I once tried doing the jam once, but got stuck in the loop of finding an idea. The jam game I showed, I don't think there was a sheep. The horse one. No, there was a Kiwi jam. Yeah, stuck in the loop of finding an idea. That's something you can often just find someone else who's also keen to jam. Like, jams are full of a lot of people, and they're all there to make something, right? So you can often find someone else and bounce ideas back and forth, and choose the idea that's the smallest. That's probably the best tip. But no, it was just a Kiwi Jam game, which is, generally Kiwi Jam's a very free-for-all kind of game jam. There's sites all over the country. So there's one held here. It was just a couple of weekends ago. So you're about a year out from the next one. Sorry. Thinking about it. the Global Game Jams held in January. Cool.
It's just about time. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we close?
No, you can check out Grimguard. It's pretty cool. Very happy to work on it. It's Grimguard Tactics by Outer Dawn. Sweet.